Welcome to Green Priorities. My name is Aidan Clark with my co-host Andrew Prentice. This latest mini-series has been dedicated to food systems. We introduced the concept of a food system. We looked at medieval systems of organizing land and the labor around it. We took you through the history of the development of industrial agriculture in its modern sense. Last week, we discussed agriculture, permacultures, alternative materialities for how to organize agroecologies. This week, you join us as we talk about animals and livestock. Many people will have seen the latest footage from David Attenborough's new documentary on the ocean, on the biodiversity systems in the ocean. And in particular, they may have seen the clip of the deep sea trawling that is done, in which an enormous amount of food waste, of sea creatures are caught together for the sake of usually just capturing one particular species and then dumping the rest, who have been essentially massacred through the process of this deep sea trawling. So it's a rather vivid image of the way that we have industrialized our food systems, and in particular the complexity that arises with other living parts of our food system, right? And the age-old question of whether to eat other living systems or not, and to what extent they're implicated in suffering, to what extent our industrial system of food is a system of suffering. So it's a good place to start. And maybe we could try and answer this question of, where are we right now with, we've looked at conventional agriculture, but what about conventional industrial livestocking?
Yeah, so basically, when you look at livestock, the major sort of uh, telltale signs of industrial livestocking is where you see sort of the either the end life cycle for cows, which ends up in feedlots, or with pigs and chickens that, will never go outside kind of thing. These are the real changes, massive changes in industrialized agriculture. Um, with a lot of them comes concentration of waste streams, comes concentration of nutrients that generally aren't meant to be fed to these animals. So you see animals that are being fed lots of waste from other processes and things like that, which absolutely affects the animals, the meat, the process itself. Um, so for instance, one of the important processes that is always talked about from an environmental perspective in terms of methane emissions is with cows. The cows today are fed huge amounts of corn, basically, because it fattens them up quickly, but it also makes them really gassy, basically. And it causes huge amounts of methane emissions and dramatically affects both the emissions from the cows, but also more importantly, the health of the cows is dramatically affected, which is important both for the people who are going to eventually end up eating the meat, but also for the fact that they then get sick and require antibiotics a lot of the time. Which I think that the effects from animal agriculture are so wide ranging, um, whether it be, again, massive amounts of antibiotics in our food systems to huge amounts of land use. Two-thirds of the land that we use for agriculture is just pasture land, but it only makes up, say, a quarter of the calories that we eat, for instance, and requires inputs from those other fields. So, an enormous amount of basically the impact of agriculture is centered around animals.
And maybe similarly to how we saw the nitrogen cycle kind of broken when we looked at growing food, there seems to be a similar kind of breakages in the natural cycles of, for instance, the integrity of the animal's health, and then the need to supplement it with antibiotics. That's a familiar story we've seen already.
And industrial inputs of all different kinds, exactly. And I think you then have to sort of you can look at this sort of caloric efficiency of animals, which is generally, so it's like someone will look and say, okay, well, what are we feeding them? And how many people could that have fed versus, okay, well, how many people could we feed with the cow that we've now grown? Um, and this is a classic, for all the vegans out there, all vegetarians, etc. This is a classic thing they'll come back to and say, well, this is why we should be vegan. I think that there's a lot more important nuance to uh, the kind of food that we eat meat has always been a staple in cuisines all around the world. It's an important cultural touchstone everywhere. The kind of industrial, uh, again, I would call it massacre for sure, that happens in these crazy facilities that we have all over North America. Um, is an important it's important to recognize that that's not always what animal husbandry's meant. We've always had animals that have been integrated with people, that maybe once lived inside the houses with us, that were a very integral part of how we lived, and that we had a better relationship with. So I think it's important also to throw that in at the beginning as we talk about animals, because it is a touchy topic for lots of people, I think.
Of course. And I think you're absolutely right that the question is about kind of the materiality of integration, of what, is there a standard in which we could reintegrate animal livestock, revitalize maybe more natural cycles, result probably in better, fundamentally better food, so that the calories we're getting are also sort of, in a sense, sort of better calories, so to speak. Um, I mean, there was a distinct moment in a way in the history of industrial livestocking when farmers moved from people who did the farming within feudal communities towards farming as a commercial practice. And in a sense, maybe that was one of the explosive moments historically where one, our relationship to food probably changed. The quantity of available food dramatically increased. That resulted in increased needs for eventually, yeah, industrial injected fertilizers, which was a process that developed properly in the 18th and 19th centuries. But also the explosion of meat eating probably again became at least a lot more sustainable, not because there was a great social change in from a culinary point of view, for instance, or a cultural point of view, as far as like, oh, we want to eat more meat now. I mean, I think historically, for instance, European cultures have tended to take a great deal of time with the meat that they have. Often they're working with cheaper cuts. Often they're trying to make the most of the meat. And in fact, that reflects the fact that maybe they're eating it, something like beef. Wow, rarely, for hundreds of years, rarely eaten. If ever, and often cows were not necessarily made for the sake of beef. And there was a distinct moment when we started to breed beef cows in the way that we might know today. And what's interesting in that story, of course, is that as we got more industrialized, we started to eat a lot more meat. And the question then was, do we eat more meat because we want to and it's a natural human right? Or did industrialization and emphasis on quantity and yield result in this kind of like artificial culture that doesn't really belong to anyone, changing our eating habits? And I guess it's sort of that would be a good definition of maybe the imbalance that we find ourselves in a little bit right now.
Exactly. And when you see cows and pigs and chickens, the various different kinds of meat that we eat in Canada, for instance, there's lots of different things that get eaten around the world. Not only are they, you know, we're not only are we eating dramatically more of them, and that they're sort of, again, taken, they're replaced sort of um, wild species, various things on our continent, right? As the major species that we have, basically, that lives alongside us. Um, the land that they take up, the resources that we put into them. But you also see that they are dramatically affecting, yeah, human health around, people who are eating too much meat, who are, we're seeing all kinds of adverse health effects for people, which is sort of another of these sort of externalities that we don't really see woven or well connected, right? That food is also integral to our health system, which is sort of also very reflexive and reactive. Um, and I think all these different, I think that food generally, and certainly meat's role in food today, is I think it's an important touchstone for what our food system is, how it thinks. As we're upgrading. We think of meat as an upgrade from say plant calories or whatever, whatever other kind of food we might be eating. But like again, like you say, that's anything but the case in history. We've, all kinds of reverence has been given to meat throughout time, right? People who have had both relationships with the animals that they're eating, but also so much relationship to the recipes that they're creating, what they do with all the parts of the animal that they use. Um, I think we also nowadays classify a lot of food as not for human consumption in a way that we didn't as well. So when you see huge food waste statistics, lots of it happens at all these parts of the food chain. Um, right up to it's in your kitchen and then you leave it out and it spoils and you have to throw it out. But all the way through that system too, there's people saying, "Oh no, that's not good for people anymore. That's not good for people anymore." All the way through, and it leads to quite a lot of waste, which is particularly problematic with meat. Meat is really an exacerbation of all the other problems in our food system already.
Yeah, maybe we might break down a few of the things you've already introduced in a little bit greater depth. I mean, we've spoken about waste and caloric efficiency, but what about some of these impacts to land, emission impacts? I mean, looking at the sort of the scale also at which we are doing agricultural livestocking.
Yeah, so roughly, like I said earlier, roughly 2/3 of agricultural land is used for livestock, which is a lot. If you think about how much land space we actually use, which is like roughly 30% of the Earth's surface is all for agriculture. Yeah, 2/3 of that is pasture, um, which is both a lot of space to spend on it, but also it's taking up a huge amount of wild space that we used to have, which was crucial for all kinds of other parts of our food system. So the kind of biodiversity that we see in wild spaces that still exist has been replaced largely by animal agriculture. And an often cited sort of piece of this is people will say, oh, well, we raise animals on land that couldn't be used for agriculture otherwise. And that's often true. One of the things that's more true lately about that is that it has been the impetus for burning down rainforests basically a lot, in South America, and all around basically felling forests to build pastures. So there's a lot of but any land that we use for agriculture is always going to displace something else. So we always have to think about our efficiencies there. And when we think about sort of the caloric efficiency of meat, like I was saying before, it's very much an intensification of all of the other inputs that we have, in addition to new inputs that are now required for a new living, breathing thing. So, if say for every plant calorie you get, 4 plant calories, you get 1 meat calorie out, for instance, or 4 to 1 roughly for protein. It's more like 2 to 1 for chickens, more like 10 to 12 for cows. So a good number is 1 to 4. Then you're looking at all the problems that we talked about in our last episode, the struggles with producing all these things, the industrial inputs, the industrial outputs, the runoff to lakes, all of these different things. Okay, well now every bit of cow that we eat, every bit of cow that we waste goes to this multiplied section of all of the industrial inputs and outputs that we had from the plants that those cows are eating. So they very much still are grown, just also with this new massive requirement of space and time and medicine usually.
Well, and it seems as if we'll just continue to accelerate and expand the inputs required because there are no basically cultural, what I would call cultural constraints on food eating, on the practice of any part of the food system, whether it's the farming, whether it's keeping livestock, and eventually, of course, distributing and selling food, and also finally, again, consuming it. Um, such few cultural constraints and very little opportunity to introduce cultural constraints. In many ways, a cultural constraint is considered to be a barrier to some form of development or some a process of production, right? What people might call red tape. And similarly, taking care of wild spaces, having a discussion about biodiversity are considered to be antithetical to the movement of our economic systems, of course. And therefore there's very little room for a process where you might say, okay, can we one can or we if we wanted to scale this back, would we be allowed to politically? But two, perhaps more importantly, do we have a concept of what it would mean to scale back? Do we what are the methods and the philosophies and the materialities that would allow us to scale back? I think that maybe there's definitely some insight to vegan arguments that discuss calories and and you've already mentioned it. We've sort of gestured in the direction of our of the history of our agricultural systems. But it's also true that the last 1,000 years have been a history of getting out of traditional agriculture towards commercial and industrial agriculture. And therefore, we might have to address our reliance upon industrialization generally, which, as I was arguing earlier, seems to vastly overdetermine the foodstuff that we have. We haven't simply created a system where we're just sort of producing a little bit more of what we were already producing 1,000 years ago, but we're doing it quicker, and we're doing it safer, or we're doing it right with greater industrial advancements. The truth is, we're creating food in a completely different way. And if you were hard pressed to ask a person, well, what's your definition of food? What's your definition? And then of course you can look at, the index of suffering, say, when you look at living systems in our food, right? Which of course are not always actually just going to be killed. One can return to cattle, right? The use of cattle in farming was typically because of their bulk, their muscles, their capacity to move and help to till fields, not necessarily to be eaten for beef, which would be considered a big waste, actually. Especially they're involved in the dairy process as well. The male cows, of course, in the breeding process, the animal husbandry dimension. So even that, the multi-purpose use of an animal is something we've also lost through specialization. And yeah, you'd be hard pressed to say, so what is our food right now? It's maybe the image of a perfect piece of beef or a perfect pepper, which of course is a fantasy. It's not at all reflective of how we produce, or any of these sort of outlets of multi-purpose use or social texture or cultural constraints. And the great kind of political void of the entire process is we don't seem to have a lot of right to make a change, even if we wanted to. And often how it's framed is, well, we need to be able to feed 8 billion people, and we can't possibly afford to do it in any less of an industrial way. And I think these are two very, very, very mistaken ideas, which reinforce this entire kind of paradigm of industrial agriculture and industrial livestock.
And I think that again, meat is a good place to look at that exact sort of dysphoria because it really does reflect the sort of ineptitude of a system to make a decision that actually saves us an enormous amount of time and requirement for this industrial efficiency that we need, Like we look at how much, if we say we produce 4 times as much food as we actually need, or 8 times, but by the time you have produced the meat and you've accounted for the food waste involved in this whole system, you're looking at a huge amount of waste, let alone, like you say, all of the other purposes that animals once served. Um, yeah, exactly.
Maybe the extreme waste of livestock, though. I mean, the fact that it's not even that we're sort of just barely producing enough to feed 8 billion people, we're actually producing so dramatically in excess of what people actually need to eat. Not to mention the internal costs as you go animal by animal and process by process in the animal, in the development of foodstuff from animals. You can see again the feed that we give them and then the antibiotics. But we produce well in excess of what we need. And that should be an indication. And it's something that we've said really from the beginning of this episode series on food, that like, I'm not convinced we have a food system. I think that's probably my basic thesis, which is that because when we look at how do we produce livestock, I'm not sure we have animals. I'm not sure that it has anything to do with an animal. And in that respect, one could even argue that vegans are not nearly radical enough, that they think that, the limit here is suffering. No, the limit, we passed that limit long ago. And when we created something that I'm not convinced is one even considered alive, any more than wool or wheat are considered alive, you know what I mean, or any other commodity. But yeah, the fact that it seems to be when the emphasis is on industrial quantities and industrial yields, and then society has to reorganize itself actually to fit with this particular excessive logic of production. So who cares what happens to our health systems? Who cares what happens to the biodiversity of our land? Who cares what happens to the animals themselves? Like, we are all, in a sense, kind of sidelined by the engine of industrial productivity that once again is sold as if, well, if we turn this engine off, human society is going to collapse. I think that's kind of the apocalyptic setting in which this is presented. And yet, in my opinion, is that industrial agriculture seems to overdetermine the agricultural part of that equation. And again, if you look at the history, and the very particular moments again when farmers move from farming, from raising animals, and all the cultural constraints that are implicit in that life, independent of scale here. This isn't just about small versus large. It's two completely different ways of interacting. One with an animal, with a field, and a version of industrial production that has, I think, basically nothing to do with land or with animals in particular. And this is something I think we're trying to qualify in mounting the evidence the way we are. But there's that movement from the farmer who is selling, rather who is growing, to the farmer who starts to sell. And what's interesting is that you also get out of this process that happens over many generations in Europe in particular, the beginnings also of the kind of the ugly effects of industrial agriculture, not only just in health systems, but also in the economic systems. I mean, a really famous example, the early uh, 19th century, there was a series of things called the Corn Laws that came in that were meant to protect suppliers, domestic suppliers, around 1815, from imported food stuff. So the idea was to establish some kind of protectionist suite of economic policies that could keep British corn protected with all of its uses, right, in livestock and so on. And the problem was that then there were a series of slowdowns and extreme disadvantages to not being connected with the growing international supply system. That these protectionist policies were considered, in particular, by many economists at the time, to be kind of counterintuitive, and to be sort of dismantling the sort of system of free transaction and exchange that we're slowly establishing. And the sad thing is, it's difficult once you've gone that far, and it's been hundreds of years of this commercial practice of agriculture. It's very difficult to go back and start taking apart this system of, again, yields for the sake of commerce, which is again a very specific way of maintaining the fragile balance of your agriculture, right? If farmers organize their farming life off the basis of what they can sell as private marketeers in national markets, and this is a history that develops over a couple hundreds of years, it becomes impossible to just go and dismantle that, because they don't have the center of the kind of the village life, or the natural ways of fertilizing, or the permacultures that we discussed last episode. All of those things have gone out the window, and it becomes an intense kind of political project to try and to re-secure the basic balance of the food system or the industrial system generally. But yeah, as this process happens from growing to selling, and it really is that really is the movement, and it kind of highlights, I suppose, our sense of dysphoria about our food system. Is it about growing, or is it about selling? And I don't think it's an overestimation to say that this is a system of selling and a way of using commerce to organize, okay, yes, things like agriculture, but you get so many negative, uh, again, externalities, consequences you can't even interpret as products of the system. Not to mention, yet from imbalance in the system itself. The system doesn't even work according to some even coherent sense of agricultural materiality, from the sickness of the animals to the degradation of the foodstuff itself. Um, but also all of these accidental sort of kind of economic catastrophes that are considered to be um, somehow related to the food stuff and the sort of, for instance, the boom and bust of agricultural commodities. But it's just not true. It's just the boom and bust of any commodity. And it just so happens that when your commodity is a really sensitive, fragile thing like food, yeah, you're more inclined maybe to boom and bust. But definitely, I mean, if we're to approach maybe the question of sort of reintegration, um, you've got this political question of how do you avoid triggering kind of this collapse? How do you how do you organize a kind of exchange of one way of doing food towards sort of a different way of doing food, maybe just doing food. And also, yeah, how do you address the questions of scale, once again? Though I suppose we're already approaching the answer that, again, scale is vastly overemphasized.
And I think one of the other crucial things that you touched on there is that it is really difficult to do anything with our food system as it is today, because not only because it's so entrenched and it's been there for so long, but also because it is how we feed ourselves. And people are very touchy about, you know, trying to reorganize our global supply chains. And, you know, even when you see something like aluminum is suddenly scarce, people are like, oh my gosh, we have to, you know, it's a crisis. Um, you know, and we might look to that sort of intense dependence on a massive web that we do today, as one of the many disadvantages of industrial agriculture generally. But when looking towards a transition forward, I think that, yeah, it will really have to be, like we talked about with housing, probably really interesting local solutions at a design level that can then be up, you know, brought up to a larger scale and also interconnected with each other thoughtfully. And, you know, what organization or group is going to do that? That's the big question. You know, probably it won't be a commercial endeavor. Probably it won't be a government thing. It'll have to be something sort of in between. I think animals are I think as with all agriculture, animals have a really uh, crucial sort of in between phase that they're in right now, where sort of there's two sort of groups of people who are forming in response to industrialized agriculture. There's people who are saying, okay, well, this isn't working, so we can go even harder into this. So, like we talked about with hydroponics or aquaponics last time, the even more industrialized version of meat is lab grown meat. That's the big thing. People, you know, we're talking about lab grown meat, or you're talking about say like more intensive forms of farming. Fish farming is becoming a massive thing right now with all kinds of consequences in various different ways. So that's the path that sort of the people who are see, okay, well, we're gonna, you know, clearly, you know, these are the problems with industrial agriculture. We're not going to question the commercialism of it. We're just looking to, okay, what can we do to solve these industrial inputs and outputs with more industrial inputs and outputs, basically. And then on the other side, you have people who are interested in basically, you know, bespoke farming, local farms. The organic movement was sort of maybe the biggest version of this that was like a really, you know, it's proliferated all through grocery stores now, and it's become this, again, intensely commercialized model. So I think anything that we're going to do has to be more bulletproof than the organic model was, because the organic model was very much it's such a marketing problem now. It's bogged down by huge amounts of legalities to them. How do you become an organic farm? You know, I know farmers near where we live who aren't organic farms because they don't want to or can't afford to pay for the regulations and the regulatory stuff that basically someone has to come in and check their farm regularly, or because they can't then let the chickens roam free, for instance, in particular ways. That's why they, you know, they aren't meeting the organic farming certification. So I think that we're going to have to be a bit more thoughtful with any sort of system that we choose to move to moving forward, and look to like some kind of much more distributed decision making process for that.
And I think some of the things you mentioned are what contribute to, for many people, the kind of catastrophe of what we could call green technocracy. At its worst, it's greenwashing. But it is also, yeah, these sort of kind of high tech solutions, in a sense, to lab grown meat, even political concepts like net zero, which seem to come with this fiction that we can maintain the vast systems of commerce and finance that we have that organize every single process in our lives and still kind of maintain the basic integrity of our food systems or our health systems, et cetera. And I think that this the idea that we just need more regulation or more technocracy to organize this, it's unsurprising that this draws the ire of so many people, for instance, on the right, who call this bureaucracy and red tape. And I think that they're sort of right for the wrong reason. I think it is a great, um, it is a failure, not because the goals are misplaced in terms of trying to find how to balance out, okay, say naively the economy and the environment. But of course, what the right in this kind of sort of libertarian thrust does underestimate is there might be a bigger conflict between the environment and the economy. I find it sort of sad, for instance, that even the Green Party of Canada will maintains this fiction that these things can sort of naively go together. We can just have a green economy. I think that for them, what it means is, well, we can have green entrepreneurs, we can have people in the private sector who can come up with green solutions. I think there's some truth to that, but unfortunately, however functional that system might be, it's a small part of the broader system of commerce and finance that we have to go about introducing, as you were saying, greater levers of decision making. And I think for many people, what the economy and what industrialization has represented is like a one sort of more metaphorically a sense of control over the natural world, a sense of control over our sort of human destiny. And it has been an extremely interesting process in terms of the agriculturalists, the scientists, the geologists who over a number of hundreds of years, in particular in the British agricultural revolution, developed so much of the pieces of this complex puzzle that we now basically are completely dependent upon, as you already mentioned. And, this is sort of a kind of, again, we'll call it a materiality that is very different from organic farming, very different from the sort of feudal farming that we sometimes refer to, at least out of an interest to understand how the social and legal description of land allowed a huge at scale a system of food production, even though it was, of course, counterbalanced by radical inequalities in the political system. Um, but yeah, there were a number of researchers who, whether they're looking at how the beginnings of the fertilizer system, in Chile in the 18th century, giant deposits were found full of sort of salt deposits, in effect, that they could use and ship over to Britain and help serve as fertilizer. In other cases, they would dig up fossils in the ground that were basically ancient left sort of a fecal matter, basically, of ancient life forms, and they could mix this with sulfuric acid and turn it basically to become a kind of fertilizer. This was, on the one hand, trying to maintain the integrity of the soil and such things when you're increasing the industrial scale. But I think it's important maybe that we do talk about some of these interesting scientific materialities, even though they were probably best caricatured in Mary Shelley's great novel, of course, Frankenstein. And she was entirely talking about these things. She was talking about the chemists, the biologists, to an extent, even the economists. And I think that it was kind of a Pandora's box we opened in terms of, well, we can do what nature does. We can completely reinvent a natural system. We can create a new species of cow or of sheep. I mean, it was the Romans, 2,000 years ago, who introduced white sheep to Wales, and then they were bred with the native black sheep, and it created this sort of modern mountain Welsh sheep. I've already mentioned selective breeding, but they did selective breeding for sheep as well, and whether they wanted bigger coats with finer bones, but also still sort of properly fat animals. And you know, in my opinion, the next step is not to say we have an enormous amount to learn from the way that nature and the ecology of nature kind of has set up species, sets up environments. But one should imagine it as a kind of simulated social process of its own that just takes 10,000 years or a million years or a billion years. We have an enormous amount to learn, but we shouldn't, I don't think this is about a return to nature. In fact, if anything, I almost would argue the opposite. Mother Nature is much more ruthlessly engaged in the social sort of catastrophe, the kind of Frankenstein's monster, as it were, that is nature. And again, there's an enormous amount of suffering in nature as it tries to figure itself out. Maybe we don't have the luxury to introduce so much suffering as we try and figure it out. But and all of these examples that I've mentioned, and the kind of liberating scientific materialities of the British agricultural revolution are very difficult to put back in the box because actually they're much more natural than even some of these kind of, what we might call neo-pagan kind of return to or yeah, what in a naive sense maybe organic farming is a reference to. It doesn't. I mean, one, it has of course the challenge of overcoming commerce and finance, but then it also has the challenge of, I think, also contributing a coherent materiality of ecology, which it doesn't actually necessarily do, because for me, scale has a lot less to do with feeding 8 billion people, which I'm convinced actually we can do. And a lot more to do with, yeah, what's the scale of materiality and decision making that we allow ourselves, and how experimental are we allowed to be, and how much, because we can have an enormous impact in the development of ecologies and the development of species and the development of plant matter, and of course finally in our relationship with animals. For me, this is why it's such a political question, you know yeah.
And I think that one of the things that we have with us that we talked about sort of last episode that helps us in our pursuit of sort of figuring out the answer and understanding and perhaps minimizing suffering in our sort of our path forward and searching for a solution to all the various problems that we've caused is that we have this bank, right, that we talked about last time, this resource bank that we've now actually, many of our industrial processes are just really this ability to use resources that have been banked for us over centuries or millennia. Um, whether that's underground aquifers or an amount of emissions we can put in the air before we're going to start to see problems. We've already sort of run out of that bank. Um, but the various different sort of ideas that, okay, well, these are the ways in which we can bring about more if we need it to be able to smooth over any mistakes that we might make. Problem is that we're using it right now sort of to just pull more and more for the sake of more. And I think animals are absolutely, again, this like we said last time, they're not necessarily better or more efficient. They're just bigger. We're doing things bigger than we were. And it's not even bigger in terms of the scale. It's just bigger in terms of what we're trying to do with it generally. We're trying to, again, create this food for, to sell as much of it as possible and to produce as much of it as possible. And in the process, we're draining all of our accounts. Um, and I think that sort of, it's funny, that very financial term is a really, really good description actually for our sort of ecological endowment we come to this problem with. Um, and I think that as we move forward with trying to understand and rebuild new processes, we want to, again, financially, we want to learn to invest better than we are right now. We want to learn to be able to sort of, again, it's not just I mean, of course, it's about a relationship. It's about having building a culture that makes sense, but it makes sense with sort of, again, reinvesting and not constantly drawing from these natural pools of resources that we have, as best we can.
And we almost have to rehabilitate nature. I mean, we have to rehabilitate the capacity to make decisions with nature. There's a ceramic artist who, sort of Dutch ceramic artist based in New York, who talks about growing, not making, which is such an interesting phrase. And again, it might sound kind of hokey to some people who are interested in the vast commercial scale of industrial agriculture, but I think the emphasis of growing rather than making is about the engagement and with material nature. And if material nature is itself actually quite a deracinated system, in other words, I don't again think nature just works according to some plan, but actually sort of has to violently introduce colliding paradigms of functionality itself, and it just has the time to do so. We have, I think, less of the time to do so. But I think we also have maybe more of an intensified spiritual responsibility, as far as the taking of responsibility for what we have around us. And again, you can almost divide the challenge into two different. We have, well, there's two steps at least here. There is just this pure political conversation. Do we have? Can we have a conversation? But how to have the conversation, right? Do we have? How do we mobilize paradigms like growing, not making? What literally does that mean in terms of an engagement with? Again, if we're looking at animals are not going to do the things that maybe they did in the 13th century. They're not going to maybe pull the plows. So is it a question of having chickens in your backyard, but we maintain the same kind of nuclear family setup, the same kind of, with our real estate markets intact? You can see the attraction of some of these greenwashed ideas, but probably there's something beyond either that we haven't considered yet. And do we have the room to engage with nature and natural materiality, such that we can figure it out, right? Because I just don't think we know, actually. I don't think we know what our relationship with animals should be. And I think that the second thing is then to provide some of these more concrete materialities. And I think, again, actually, scale is probably our friend here. I think thinking about a food system, at least the size of a region or even the size of a country in some cases, is actually helpful to understand just how much we can influence a process. I think we should not underestimate the kind of Promethean capacity of human beings to to stabilize and destabilize. But stability is not going to come from trying to find some fiction in nature, some kind of myth in nature where, okay, now we left the good plan that had been written in. I think, again, it's just nature is not just a bank in terms of in terms of, sort of the ecology that already exists, but in terms of the astonishing ways of doing things, the concepts in nature, in other words. There's a kind of sort of irreducible conceptual ecology to nature that we also have to sort of take transfers from, or kind of, uh, withdraw from. Um, but as a means of, yeah, greater, obviously, politicizing our engagement with food. I mean, again, the perfect apple, or the perfect piece of tuna, or the perfect chicken is has everything to do with removing the friction of our food systems. And it's, if you can imagine it, it's almost like, well, we want it to look perfect, because if we know it looks perfect when we write it into the commercial ledger, which organizes the transactions of foodstuffs or anything, there are no hitches, no interruptions to the process of commerce. But you have to ask yourself, how far can this process of commerce go? In After a certain point, it also has kind of dead weight of its own, which we're just not factoring in. And considering that commerce has been really the most efficient system of agriculture, as far as overloading uh, older styles of politics and our relationship with land. And let's not underestimate the extent to which the market did bring extraordinary freedom, again, to the farmer. But probably there's another thing we need to reinvent. Who is the farmer? Is the farmer the person who sells foodstuff? Does that even make sense? Or is the farmer supposed to be someone who, yeah, grows and doesn't sell? And we definitely have to ask ourselves what the purpose of commercial materiality is, where it fits in, if it fits in at all. Because I'm not convinced that it does practically, and then the scary thing is I don't know if politically we're allowed to get rid of it, or what options we have for renegotiating that contract.
I think that going forward, we're going to have to consider, yeah, a whole new kind of relationship between, yeah, the farmers and who they are and what they're going to do, but also, yeah, between them and the sellers, between them and the people eating the food. If there is going to be people in between, who are those people going to be and how are they going to operate, right? Like, what is the relationship even between the people who move the food from place to place and the people who sell it, kind of thing? And of course, like with everything that we talk about, yeah, reintegrating these things with seasons, reintegrating, people's relationship with work. If maybe there actually is more to do sometimes of the year than others, that it isn't just sort of this blanket across the whole year. And I think that one of the nice things about agriculture is that it is an enormous amount of space that we're working with right now. That we have everything to gain right now. We can, at any step of the process that we choose to intervene and to try striking out and taking on new things, we can make a pretty big difference, whether that be in land use, emissions, all of these different things, but also in terms of their cultural integration with cities. Like every city in the world is surrounded by farms. And these ideas can be really local to begin with. They can be someone who actually comes up with a coherent way of getting food to people without having to sell it, for instance, or getting food. You can do it at a very, very small scale at first, and we can look at either integrating many of these smaller local things or moving these ideas between different farms and scaling them up. There's all kinds of capacities I think that we have to be able to do just that kind of thinking at a very small level. And almost you see it almost everywhere in every city that you go to, you see these little tiny food startups. You see small farms, you see urban farms. And that's the thing I really like about food as a particular topic is that it's not gate kept in the same way. Anyone can grow a pepper in their backyard. Whereas, if you're looking at healthcare or transportation, there's so many things that are so deeply built in. I think that it be built into our infrastructure that are required in order to think differently. But I think that anyone who owns, relatively easily a piece of land outside the city can all of a sudden, start farming and producing food at whatever kind of process that they want to produce. They just need to work with their community to sort of build that relationship.
Like with our real estate markets, though, where we think of a house as its resale value, not as a house, we're going to have to figure out, well, what kind of system can help us have food be food? And I think that rather than that being kind of an empty statement, it's going to take a lot of thought. And the irony is, we're going to have to let culture, I think, itself grow back. In that culture is really just a bridge between really one material and another, and we're going to have to figure out the system that gives us a sufficient definition of food, not unlike a commercial system gives us a very good definition of the house through its resale value or as an asset. In so many ways, it's an extraordinary definition. I think it's just expired in its usefulness. And these definitions are all across agriculture as well. But growing culture means well, again, two things. I think you're right that there is definitely this local dimension, and it is anyone can grow a pepper. But I think we also have to. I think there is some advantage to thinking at scale. I think there's some advantage to thinking about just how big an ecology is, how big an environment can be. Um, that might reassure people as how political a food system is, though. And, it isn't just a question of sort of guerrilla efforts, though I think that we might have to, get certain zones, again, as we sometimes discuss, where we can kind of decouple them from commercial transaction. But you are required to figure out every dimension of that life. In order for it to sort of work as a properly decoupled thing, or at least sort of major structures. Again, you can see the advantage to some extent of that kind of green business in the private sector who can provide some minimal technology of transition. I think that's another good logic in terms of working and recycling existing commercial systems. But working at scale, I think, will prove quite important, and growing culture, which means we don't have the culture right now to grow food. If you were to turn off our food systems right now, we would not have the sort of European grandmothers in the back ready to plant turnips, or people with because actually it's hundreds of years ago since we did growing like that, and we never did it without a similarly violent political system, which of course was feudalism. So we don't have the culture yet in some rather kind of devastating sense. And I think it's also why when you look at an organic farm, when you look at even some cases where there is decouplement, you don't necessarily see, though, um, maybe what I would call the ecological impact of it. It is too contained because there are existing legal constraints, and there's cultural constraints insofar as there's just a lack of cultural reciprocity in terms of if it takes generations to develop not just a competent view for how to till the land, but then you get, a special kind of plow from China if you're in Holland in 1730, and it completely changes how you can till the land. There's also been a disaster in terms of actually what international trade has meant. I think one of the transitional systems between modern capitalism and feudalism was mercantilism, which was a proto-capitalist system. But the importing of different kinds of materialities was still done with a reasonable degree of texture, whereas now the sterility of international transaction and exchange is yet again another critique of commerce and finance as they exist. We don't import terribly interesting technologies, and when they are interesting, they generally help us accelerate some process of commercial agriculture, or worst yet, in our post 2008 world, it's actually, let's just sell the fiction of a really good working agricultural technology, but just don't go and look and see if the actual technology is working. As long as we keep every part of the system functional, from the transport of the technology to the financial system to the macro issues of inflation, as long as everything like that is stable, then we can assume that normal transactions are happening, and therefore society is happy and healthy, and those technologies are being used to just continue the great struggle of man to become even more modern and even more high tech and even more, again, Promethean. But it sucks that the post 2008 world, of course, is a giant fiction, and in a sense, financial systems are the last great bulwark between us realizing just how empty-handed, I think, unfortunately, not even our culture in terms of Italian culture or French culture, but I mean the languages and the engaged relationships that we have, almost the kind of nonverbal relationships that we can have with the environment or with building, or what have you. I mean, it's those things that we've lost, and it'll take a massive political project, I think, to resuscitate engagement itself.
Definitely. And I think that's especially with food, which is something we have such an intimate relationship with, that's our job moving forward.
You have been listening to Green Priorities. This was our third episode dedicated to food systems. I'm Aidan Clark with my co-host Andrew Prentice. Thank you for listening.